Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. In the opening moments, the screen is filled with evocative visuals. Dense, shadowy forests that whisper of secrets long buried, flickering lanterns slicing through the night, and tense, hurried movements near hidden border crossings. The atmosphere is thick with suspense, immersing the viewer in a world where danger and hope walk hand in hand. A hushed, urgent narration begins, immediately grabbing attention. It challenges what most people think they know, that the story of the Underground Railroad ends at the U.S. border. In fact, for many, crossing into Canada was just the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with both relief and continued vigilance. This wasn't merely an escape, it was a migration toward a fragile freedom. The voiceover teases a deeper, largely untold story, the continuation of the Underground Railroad on Canadian soil, a place where thousands found not just refuge, but a chance to rebuild lives long denied to them. The opening sets the tone for an emotional, enlightening journey into a hidden side of history. The Underground Railroad was neither underground nor a railroad. It was a covert network of brave individuals and safe places that helped enslaved African Americans escape from bondage in the southern United States to freedom in the North and eventually to Canada. Operating in the early to mid-19th century, this movement relied on a complex system of stations, conductors, and passengers, code words that masked the real and dangerous work being done. These stations were homes, churches, barns, any place that could provide shelter, food, and a brief respite from the constant threat of capture. Conductors were the guides, risking everything to lead people through forests, across rivers, and along back roads under cover of night. Among the most iconic figures was Harriet Tubman, herself an escaped slave who returned to the South again and again, leading over 70 people to freedom. Her bravery and deep knowledge of secret routes made her a legend even in her own time. Another key figure was Levi Coffin, a white Quaker abolitionist who helped over 3,000 escapees by opening his home in Indiana and later Ohio as a sanctuary. These individuals and thousands of lesser-known but equally courageous allies formed the backbone of this secret movement. The Underground Railroad was an act of collective defiance, a grassroots rebellion against the institution of slavery, built not on weapons, but on courage, compassion, and an unyielding belief in human freedom. For many freedom seekers, reaching the northern U.S. states was not enough. The passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 changed everything. This harsh law empowered slave catchers to pursue and capture escaped enslaved people anywhere in the United States, even in states that had outlawed slavery, and forced local authorities to assist in their return. It also put free Black individuals at risk of being kidnapped and falsely claimed as fugitives. Nowhere in the U.S. was truly safe, and so the journey had to continue further north, across the border into British North America, what is now Canada. Canada became a beacon of hope because of a defining legal change. The British Empire had abolished slavery in 1834. This meant that anyone who set foot on Canadian soil was legally free, regardless of their past. There were no slave catchers, no legal threats of being dragged back into bondage. Canada offered what the United States could not: protection under the law. For those fleeing the horrors of enslavement, Canada represented more than just a distant country. It was the promised land, a symbol of ultimate safety and freedom. Stories spread through word of mouth and coded messages about this northern sanctuary, where Black families could live openly, own property, and raise children free from fear. Canada didn't promise a perfect life. Racism still existed, but for those escaping slavery, it offered something sacred, a chance to live as a human being. As escapees made their way through the perilous terrain of the United States, their final and most critical leg often led them across the border into Canada. These were not easy crossings. Many happened in the dead of night, through dense forests or icy rivers, under constant threat of being caught. Key entry points emerged over time, places where the Underground Railroad's reach extended across the border. Niagara Falls, with its powerful river and rugged landscape, became a natural crossing point. Further west, Windsor and Amherstburg in Ontario stood directly across from Detroit, offering some of the most frequently used routes into freedom. These towns would become some of the earliest and largest Black settlements in Canada. Canadian, conductors played a vital role once fugitives crossed the border. While the U.S. side of the railroad is better known, a network of safe houses and guides also existed in Canada to help the newly arrived get oriented, find shelter, and begin their new lives. Churches, abolitionist groups, and free Black communities worked together to offer food, clothing, and legal support. Conductors in Canada were often formerly enslaved people themselves, those who knew the fear and the hope that came with the journey. They acted not just as guides, but as lifelines, helping newcomers adjust to a new world where they were free but still faced hardships. To help viewers visualize this hidden network, the video would show animated maps tracing common routes from southern slave states through Ohio and Michigan, then across rivers into Ontario. Visuals would depict lantern-lit paths through the woods, small boats crossing the Detroit River, and safe houses nestled in quiet Canadian towns. This segment reveals how the Underground Railroad did not stop at the border. It evolved, adapting to a new terrain and continuing its mission of freedom deep into Canadian soil. Once in Canada, freedom seekers didn't just survive, they built. Across Ontario, vibrant Black settlements took root, becoming symbols of resilience, determination, and self-reliance. Among the most prominent were Buxton, Dresden, Chatham, and Owen Sound. These weren't just temporary shelters, they were thriving, self-sustaining communities where formerly enslaved people and their descendants could live with dignity, raise families, and contribute to society on their own terms. In Buxton, known formally as the Elgin Settlement, newly arrived families built homes, opened schools, and founded churches. Education was a cornerstone. Schools in Buxton were known for their academic excellence, and many Black children there outperformed their white counterparts. Dresden and Chatham became centers of Black political thought and activism. Chatham, in particular, was home to the legendary Anti-Slavery Society of Canada and hosted notable abolitionist events, including meetings attended by John Brown as he planned his raid on Harper's Ferry. These communities were not isolated or inward-looking. They produced newspapers that advocated for civil rights, organized to resist racial discrimination, and contributed to the broader fight for justice across North America. Real individuals brought these towns to life. People like Mary Ann Shadd Cary, a journalist, educator, and the first Black woman publisher in North America, who founded the Provincial Freeman newspaper in Chatham, or Josiah Henson, whose life story partially inspired Uncle Tom's Cabin, and who helped found a settlement and manual labor school near Dresden. The Black Canadian population, made up largely of escapees and their descendants, played a critical role in shaping the identity and strength of these towns. They farmed the land, opened businesses, trained tradespeople, and fostered a spirit of mutual aid and cultural pride. These settlements were more than places of refuge. They were proof that formerly enslaved people could not only dream of freedom, but could build it, brick by brick, on new soil. While the Underground Railroad is often romanticized as a flawless path to freedom, the reality in Canada was more complex. One of the biggest myths is that the railroad remained just as secretive once fugitives crossed the border. In truth, while secrecy was critical in the United States to evade slave catchers and hostile laws, many Canadian communities operated more openly. Safe houses sometimes functioned in plain sight, and newspapers even reported on the arrival of escaped slaves. The threat of capture largely vanished at the border, but that didn't mean all dangers disappeared. Another widespread myth is that Canadian society was entirely welcoming. While Canada offered legal freedom, social acceptance was far from guaranteed. Racism still existed in many forms. Black Canadians often faced discrimination in employment, housing, and education. In some towns, schools were segregated. In others, white residents actively pushed back against the growing presence of Black communities. In certain areas, there were petitions demanding that Black families be removed or denied land. The dream of freedom sometimes collided with the harshness of racial prejudice. Segregation wasn't always enforced by law, but it was often upheld by custom. Black settlers were sometimes denied service at businesses or excluded from public events. And while they could vote and own property, that didn't mean their voices were always heard or respected. These realities added another layer of difficulty to starting over in a new land. Still, despite the resistance and discrimination, Black Canadians pushed forward. They organized, resisted, and built institutions that affirmed their worth and identity. Acknowledging these challenges doesn't diminish the legacy of the Underground Railroad. It deepens our understanding of what true freedom meant. It wasn't just about crossing a border. It was about fighting for dignity and equality in a world that didn't always welcome them, even on so-called free soil. The legacy of the Underground Railroad in Canada goes far beyond the 19th century. It laid a foundation for the country's civil rights movement and helped shape a distinct Black Canadian identity rooted in resistance, resilience, and community. The descendants of freedom seekers became farmers, teachers, clergy, entrepreneurs, and activists. Their presence not only challenged racial boundaries, but also demanded inclusion in the Canadian story. The institutions they built, schools, churches, and newspapers, became platforms for civil rights advocacy, long before such efforts gained mainstream recognition. These early Black settlements served as blueprints for organizing and empowerment. The experiences of those who arrived through the Underground Railroad informed later struggles against systemic racism in Canada, from efforts to end school segregation to demands for fair housing and labor rights. Activists throughout the 20th century often looked back to the railroad generation as proof that progress could be made through collective strength and perseverance. Today, the memory of this powerful movement is preserved in museums, monuments, and cultural heritage sites across Canada. The Uncle Tom's Cabin, historic site in Dresden dedicated to the life of Josiah Henson, offers a vivid look into the journey from slavery to community leadership. The Amherstburg Freedom Museum documents the story of Black migration and settlement. In southwestern Ontario, housing artifacts, records, and stories passed down through generations. These places don't just commemorate history, they actively educate and inspire, ensuring that the sacrifices and triumphs of the Underground Railroad era are never forgotten. For many Canadians, the legacy of the Underground Railroad is a reminder that freedom was not given, it was seized, often at great risk, and defended every day afterward. It is a testament to how those fleeing bondage not only found safety, but helped shape a nation's conscience and character. As the story comes full circle, we are reminded that Canada was more than just a final destination. It was a lifeline. For thousands who braved the Underground Railroad, crossing into Canadian soil meant stepping into the first moments of true freedom. Though the journey was fraught with peril and the welcome not always warm, the legacy of those who made it lives on in the towns they built, the rights they fought for, and the stories they passed down. The screen fades to a slow, emotional shot of a monument, perhaps the statue of Josiah Henson at the Uncle Tom's Cabin historic site, or a descendant standing before an old, weathered church built by freedom seekers. A voice reads a quote from Marianne Shad Carey: "Self-reliance is the fine road to independence." The message lingers. Freedom was not just an escape. It was a lifelong pursuit, carried on by generations. Viewers are encouraged to visit these historic sites, walk the paths of those who came before, and help keep these stories alive. Share the lesser-known narratives of Black Canadians who helped shape a nation. And if this hidden chapter of history moved you, subscribe to the channel for more stories that reveal the past you were never taught.